Organizers for inviting me to present my work with Alex Odell and Christian Catalini today. And before we get started, I would like to ask the participants, whoever can, to turn on their videos, because I do think it's a little more personable if we can actually see each other, especially in this kind of virtual setting where everyone's so far away. It's nice to see other people. So I also have to warn all of you that my situation is kind of like in this cartoon. I have two cats, so they may be jumping around. They like to start exactly when I start presenting. So I apologize in advance. You may see a cat run through the screen. All right, and now, so the work I will be presenting today, actually, we started this 4 years ago. So here we take a deeper look at the impact of proximity on the technology adoption decisions of entrepreneurs. And when we were thinking about this 4 years ago, we had a whole different world in our head. And we weren't really expecting that situations like this would kind of disappear from one day to the next. And so this is kind of nice and comes at a very timely, is very timely to today, considering especially that now a lot of bosses just like a couple of months into the pandemic are actually voicing their concerns about what may happen when people are taken apart from each other and no longer working together. And they especially fear that this will have long-lasting impact on the relationships and innovation may suffer as a consequence. And if we look at this from a research perspective, their hunch isn't too far removed from what research is actually suggesting. And this goes back, way back to the 70s. A book by Thomas Allen actually talked about this, of looking at how proximity may actually impact who you talk to and the relationships you form. And so some may even argue that we've taken this notion a little too far, thinking that the physical layout of offices is really the one and only solution to all evils, but that's just an aside here. And so when we think of the office, a lot of us, they have this picture of established companies in our head, right? But we have also, especially before the pandemic, we've been seeing this increasing trend of startups also locating in these co-working spaces. So startups, which may go a little bit against our notion of what founders and entrepreneurs do, that they actually want to do their own thing, may want to get away from the corporate environment, but now they're actually choosing to work in these spaces with other entrepreneurs. And so one of the reasons this could be happening is that could also be in relation to a trend that we're seeing over the past 30 years, especially, of a decrease in startup size. And this may imply that there's more reliance on other input factors and resources and environments that help these startups and these entrepreneurs, especially in terms of using shared or providing shared services, giving them advice, assistance, and mentoring. So this is where we're kind of jumping in with our project. And our baseline question here is, does physical proximity influence what startups or a startup's decision to adopt technologies by other startups? And we're taking this a step further to also try to understand what the potential performance implications could be of learning from others, because it's not straightforward that this may actually be a good thing. Now, let's take a step back though. So I just established what our main question is. I just wanted to prime you a little bit of where we're coming from. And so what you know about physical proximity in general is that the diffusion of ideas is highly, or has been found to be highly localized. In addition to that, we also have, or the research has established that it's more tacit know-how that is transferred by face-to-face interactions, which unfortunately isn't happening as much as it used to be right now, for example. And empirical research also supports that this physical proximity and the extent to which it activates can be as small as a few hundred meters. And here, Bill, I'm sorry, I stole these slides from your slides that you presented at the Entrepreneurship Research Bootcamp. And here, I love these slides because it really shows how this is so small. So if you look at the graph by Henderson in 2008, it's actually only about 750 meters as to where the distance or these cluster effects actually activate. And what we will show, or what I will show later in our results, in our case, it's even smaller. So we're showing that it's about 20 meters actually in the context of co-working spaces. So based on this, and taking it to the context of startups and entrepreneurship, we also know that entrepreneurs learn from a variety of resources or sources. And one of the very important ones is actually learning from other entrepreneurs. And another special feature of entrepreneurship is that entrepreneurs operate in a very fast-paced and uncertain environment. We're local search, so searching amongst what's close to you is very important, and experimentation and frequent adjustments occur. And so from this, it may be that just being close to others who are dealing with the same problems can really help reduce those costs of accessing relevant information just through seeing it or just talking to people because they are right beside you. And which is why our base hypothesis or prediction would be that we expect physical proximity greatly influences a startup's decision to adopt new technologies from someone else, basically, or used by other startups already. Now, we also extend this question because you can say this is kind of a replication of what Alan or previous research has already done, but more in the context of established firms or in neighborhoods. So what we do is that we also look at how this interacts with other dimensions. And here we looked at what has been looked at before. And one of the dimensions that has been suggested to be very important in terms of knowledge transfer is the social dimension. So how similar you are to others. The knowledge space, so how your knowledge overlap or what you know and what others know can impact that. And also the product market dimension. And so in a very, very stylized way, this is kind of how we're thinking about it. So our main prediction, as you can see here, is that the physical proximity will impact technology adoption. And we propose that social proximity will impact physical proximity or that it acts as a substitute more or less, because if you know someone, you may not need to be close, you will still exchange ideas. Whereas the knowledge space proximity, we expect to be a little more U-shaped, because if you have zero overlap or you have a lot of overlap, there's going to be less of a gain from being close to someone. And in terms of the product market dimension, we're really not sure ex ante what could happen, because being close, things may just spill over, or you trust these people more because they're close and you can observe them, or because you're close, now you're going to be extra careful because you really don't want them to take anything away from you. So this is what our expectations were going into this project. Now, just to give you a quick preview of the results, if anyone has to head out earlier, we do find that there's a positive impact of physical proximity on technology adoption. We also find that there is a substituting effect of social proximity to physical proximity. In terms of knowledge space, it also seems to be this U-shape. And in terms of the product market proximity, it seems to be also similar to the social proximity, more of a negative or substituting interaction that is going on there. And extending this, as I already mentioned earlier, we wanted to look at how this impacts performance. We also find that there's a positive relationship between technology adoption from proximate peer firms on performance outcomes. All right, so now to give you a little more context of where I'm getting all these ideas and all these results from. So for this project, we're looking at the time, this was the 4th largest co-working space in the US. And here are just the maps or the floor plans that we were working with. And you can see that there are 4 floors where startups are located in these office spaces. And in the middle, you can see where the elevators are and other spaces that we determined are common spaces, which are kitchens and other areas where people can locate together. Now, overall, there are about 200 rooms covering 1,000 square feet, and we collected this data over 30 months. And as you can see here in the descriptives, there were about the average age of these startups, or how long they were in this co-working space, is about a year. The average room size is about 30 square meters. And we also identified if if the startups in these rooms were predominantly, consisted primarily of females, which is the identifier for female, and what their business model was, and also we measured their technology usage. Now, the way we measure technologies is using this website called Built With, which captures the exact timing that a company uses or starts using a web component, and also when they stop using it, which is really great in our context because we can see we can see the timing between another firm and another firm when they exactly started it. So it gives you this timestamp, precise timestamp of when they actually implemented it in their websites. And the technologies we're talking about are these web components, such as Komodo, Shopify, Magento, which you probably have heard of before. And just to give you a brief idea, there are a lot of different technology groups that are actually included in this data set. Now, and also there's wide variation in terms of the technologies that startups use, which is great for our context because we have this wide variation, which is fun to work with. The way we measure distance, and here I'm just showing a heat map because just it's fun to look at these heat maps, but also this gives you a good explanation or idea of how we did this. So we measured the shortest path between each room to the other room, and also identified places where people were more likely to meet given these paths. Now, moving on to our empirical approach, which most of you will be most interested in. What we chose to do is to use startup dyads on the same floor as our unit of analysis. And here what we're trying to look at or understand is the effect of distance on the likelihood that a startup, or the amount of technologies a firm adopts from another, which on average, as you see here, is about 7. And we also look at the likelihood that a firm adopts a technology that another firm has already adopted, but it's new to this focal firm, which on average is about 50% where this is happening. And in a very naive way, our estimation would look something like this, where we're really trying to understand technology adoption as a function of distance, including some other characteristics of these dyads. However, most of you will be cringing when you see this naive estimation because, oh man, there are so many challenges and problems that you will face in this kind of setting. One of them is that, the two main problems or challenges that you face in these contexts is one of endogenous sorting, and the other is that contextual effects may also be an issue. And here, especially, it is that technology adoption could also be a characteristic or a function of the characteristics of the group. So, for example, it could be that firms select to be close to others that use similar technologies. So that's one issue. Another one is that there are similar phenomena that are occurring to people that are close. So there could be something going on that just impacts two firms that are sitting side by side, and that's what's really driving our technology exposure. And so we have to be aware that these things could be correlated. Now, how we address this, we were very lucky that, and that's why we also picked this context, is that the startups were randomly assigned to their rooms at this co-working space. And we figured this out talking to the administrators of the startup. So it was very serendipitous. We had no idea. We were talking about them about our research, and they're like, hey, yeah, we have random room assignment. So this is one way we're dealing with these challenges. The other one, and here we're following prior work, we include dyadic robust standard errors and cluster startups based on their location. So we create little neighborhoods and try to address these potential concerns of that there are that certain startups, because they're in a location, have correlated outcomes. But I will get into more detail as to how we actually do that now. So in terms of room assignment, here I'm just going to present our results where to kind of ensure that there really is random room assignment. And here what we see is that we look at all the dyad characteristics that we have that both are like B2B companies, B2C companies, majority female, and their age differences and their pre-technology overlap. And if this predicts that they are close to each other or the distance. And luckily, there is nothing. So we can, to some extent, take what the administrators were telling us about the randomness to some extent at face value. So this just gives us a little more confidence as to that there really is something, at least to some extent, randomness. In terms of clustering, so I already said we divide the floor plans into little neighborhoods and use this to create our standard errors. And here, just to give you an idea how we did that, but we did follow exactly as I showed before in the heat map, where people walk and kind of use that to create these neighborhoods. Now, the results. In terms of physical proximity, so here I'm going to show you the first 4 columns show you the results in terms of distance. So this is going to be negative, so a longer distance is further apart. And then in columns 5 to 8, we see the results looking at, we created a dummy for very close firms, so those that are in the lowest quartile of distance, which is 20 meters. And here we see that there's a positive relationship with the numbers that of technologies adopted and also the likelihood of adopting technologies. And just because I told you earlier that I have a figure that kind of fits nicely to Bill's graph earlier, is that we see that it's really the strongest impact can be found in this first quartile of, so the firms that are about 20 meters apart. Now, another concern is that because these results that we're finding could just be very spurious correlations. And to address this, we also used a new technique, or a newer technique, to like simulate what could be the results, and is this just kind of spurious what's happening. And so we used the randomization inference method suggested by, for example, Athy and Imbens, and it ran a Monte Carlo simulation of 1,000 runs. And we just randomly assigned closeness between each dyad and looked at the likelihood of adopting a technology as a function of this randomly assigned closeness. And what we find here, and so these are the results of the simulation, is that only 2 of the simulated draws were actually had a larger coefficient of what we find in our results, which gives us a lot of confidence that it's not spurious what we're finding. Now, I already mentioned that another edition of our paper was really looking at the interplay with other proximity dimensions. And here, just to give you an idea of how we operationalize these different proximity dimensions, I already mentioned, so physical proximity is really physical distance. Social proximity, we use 2 different characteristics of these dyads. And this was that where both startups are majority female, and the other is where both startups are successful. And the way we identified success is by looking at which startups have received a state award, which startups have raised money at a certain level. And so we use this to kind of identify a small group of very prestigious startups in this co-working space. Knowledge space, we looked at pre-period technology, the mean pre-period technology overlap between firms and other close firms. And in terms of product market proximity, we looked at their industry and the business model they're using to identify firms that are similar in that aspect. In terms of the results, what we find here, and I would like to turn your attention to the interaction terms. So the close and both female, the close and both successful, and the close and same product market, where in each of these 3 dimensions, we see that there's a negative interaction with physical proximity. Oops, sorry. And moving to the knowledge overlap, as I was mentioning before, I already alluded to this inverted U shape. And here what we did was created 5 quintiles in terms of the technology overlap, and we see that the strongest ones are really in the 2nd, 3rd, and a little bit in the 4th quartile of where if there's this overlap, you see an interaction or a positive relationship with physical proximity. Now, the most interesting part is trying to understand why is this happening. So what are the potential mechanisms as to why we're seeing that proximity has this impact on these different dimensions. And what we did here is kind of picking off of the earlier discussion of how that face-to-face interaction could be such an important aspect, or what is driving these results. We looked into the data that we had been given and tried to see, like, how can we figure out a way to see if this could possibly be happening or plausibly be happening. And so we were thinking about places where is there a likelihood, or a very high likelihood, that people are going to talk to each other. And here we identified a joint event that's held every Friday. It's a lunch at this co-working space. And we luckily have the exact check-in line of each individual, so their order. So when a person goes to the lunch, they have to swipe their card. And so we know exactly who was behind whom in the line. And we use this to kind of understand who's actually going to these things together and who may be actually talking to each other. And so what we did here is first tried to understand if proximity actually increases the likelihood of going together to these events. And we see that, yes, close, again, using the dummy of up to 20 meters, has a positive impact on the number of events both attend, and also the likelihood of both of attending an event together. Moving on, we also looked at conditional on jointly attending. What is the check-in line order? How close are people in these check-in lines? And what we see here is that from 1 to 5 people, there is a positive relationship. And as a nice placebo, we saw that between 10 to 25 people, this effect disappears. So it really seems that you are only going together with people who are very close to each other. So this is a very nice kind of placebo test to see if what we're saying really makes sense somehow. Now, moving to performance, because I already mentioned what we wanted to see was, like, how does this impact performance outcomes? We also looked at, so the way we addressed this, we used 2 different types of performance outcomes or measures that have been identified in the literature before. One is raising some sort of seed funding as an outcome, and another one is raising over $1 million in funding. And so, as you can see in the columns 2 and 3, 6 and 7, here we see the relationship between adopting technologies from close peers and the outcome of receiving seed funding and the likelihood of raising over $1 million. And then we also included an instrumental variable approach, where, similar to what we had discussed, or what I showed you earlier, we created the instrument using the predicted values of adopting from a peer firm from all the close firms. And we use the sum of these predicted values as our instrument. And you can see the results from this instrumental variable approach in columns 4 and 5, and 7 and 8 and 9, where the F-stats are fairly strong, and this confirms our OLS findings as well. So, and yes, and just to mention, because I've just been walking over the controls and just flying over them the whole time. So the controls we include here, for those of you who are wondering, are industry, the business model, the age, and also the gender and the pre-period technology overlap. Just, I apologize for that. All right, now to quickly summarize the results. What we do, so we find that close proximity greatly influences the likelihood of adopting an upstream production technology also used by a peer firm. So you can think of these web components, especially in the startup, in the startup space, in the high-tech online space, as like their production input. So they're using this to create their output. So this is how we were thinking about it. I'm happy to hear your ideas or what you think about how we're thinking about this. Maybe it's not really how we should be conceiving this. We also find that the effect decays with distance where startup firms that are more than 20 meters away are no longer influenced by each other. So this, I think, is a pretty strong finding, an important finding, considering that usually what we're able to observe are not these very micro geographic distances, so they're usually much further. So I think this is a way that we are contributing also to the literature. And we also, I think what's very interesting is kind of trying to understand how these other dimensions interact with the other proximity dimensions that have been discussed before, especially the social, the knowledge space, and the product market dimensions, and how these change the effect of distance on technology adoption. So this is giving a richer way of trying to understand how our social environment actually works. So I think this is a very interesting aspect of this paper. The next one is that we also find that interaction with peers is a viable mechanism that is driving our results. So we are not pinpointing down that people are really talking to each other, because that's very hard to observe. We would need some kind of tags where we can really see who's talking, what they're saying. But we're getting pretty close in terms of looking at people going together to these joint events, and also checking what kind of order they are in their check-in lines. The other finding, so what we also do is our findings suggest that technology adoption with proximate firms does contribute to achieving important startup performance milestones. However, I would like to also state a word of caution to this finding. It could also be that it's not necessarily the technology adoption per se, it's just other things that are related or correlated with that and what they're getting from their peers that is actually leading to these startup performance milestones or achieving them. But this is going to be very difficult to disentangle. Now, overall, what I think, or what we're hoping to contribute with this paper, is that is really trying to figure out, or saying that distance matters also for entrepreneurial learning, because most of the research or most of the literature has really focused on more patenting or publication outputs or other outcomes, but really taking a look at entrepreneurs and where they're located in these co-working spaces. So this is how we're trying to contribute with this paper. Another aspect is that we provide a better understanding of firm level variation in rates of entrepreneurial adoption, technology adoption choices, as I was saying, by attending to these different classes of proximity. And we also speak to the literature examining these different accelerators, boot camps, incubators, and interventions targeted at early stage startups. But we're introducing a different type of environment, which is the co-working hub in this case. And we also take another step further by shedding light on the implications of technology adoption, or the potential implications of technology adoption for startup performance outcomes. So overall, taking all these things together, our findings provide fundamental insights for the design of communities that support knowledge production, entrepreneurship, and innovation. So really thinking about how can we design these places to promote idea sharing and also promote creating knowledge together. And we also highlight that there are important trade-offs. So it's not just, oh, let's put people close together and they will share and they will create things. There are trade-offs. And so understanding that social dimensions, the knowledge dimensions, and also the competitive pressures may have an impact on how you can actually benefit from proximity is an important aspect. And so I'd like to just stress that where physical structures may lay the groundwork, so for interaction to take place, there are other factors that may actually determine how firms enact on these opportunities. So this kind of brings it back to the comic I showed earlier, where it's like, oh yes, our physical layout, that is the solution to all, but we may have to just think of this as the groundwork, and that there are other features that will actually make people share or help them actually benefit from these kind of structures. So yeah, that's where I would leave it off. I know I was pretty quick. I wanted to leave a lot of time for Bill's I'm assuming, wonderful discussion. And also I'd love to hear your comments, especially in terms of how we should think of the operationalization of these different dimensions I was mentioning, and also how you think we could really push this paper forward in terms of what the main contribution is, because I know there are a lot of things going on and this is still work in process. So I think if you have any suggestions, we would all, and I'm speaking from Alex and Christian's behalf, we would all be very happy to hear your comments in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Bill, when you're ready, you can share your screen and your slides.